One word that we hear a lot in the spiritual community is surrender. You've got to surrender. One of the ways of healing is to surrender. One of the ways to transcend is to surrender. And a lot of people will resist that and they'll be like, no, if I surrender, then I will lose everything. I will lose everything. My life's going to go to crap. I will never surrender. They turn into Corey Hart. Never surrender. Sorry. Anyway, they resist the surrendering, and I totally understand that. But you also have to understand, we all have to, that people who resist surrendering are coming at it from an ego perspective. If you surrender from a place of ego, that's when things really go down. Now, granted, you will lose things when you surrender either way, whether you're surrendering from the lower self or the higher self, or the small self and the true self, But there will be a difference, because if you surrender from ego, then chances are you are not going to, whatever you lose will not be replaced the way you're hoping it does. And you're going to work and push to get those things replaced. Now, granted, is there a time and place for that? Sure. But there's so much upstream paddling that it becomes a real tiring pursuit. Whereas if you surrender from the place of knowing your true self, that it's a fractal of the divine, that you're going to be okay. It's all going to work out. You may not lose anything, but if you do lose, you know that something better is coming along. You have to trust that. Now, that better may not be what you necessarily think is better, at least from the get-go, from the beginning. You might have to give it some time, even though there's no such thing as time. You may have to align with it, or actually it will be aligned with you already. But your small brain, from an ego's perspective, once again, hopefully will begin to align to the fact that what's happening in its place is better and was meant to happen that way. Whereas, like I said, anytime, when things don't go the way you want, it's our ego that tells us that. Oh, it's not going the way I want. Things aren't going the way I want anyway, so why should I surrender? Maybe because things weren't going the way you wanted. You know what I mean? So I know it's a bit of a paradox. It's a conundrum. It's a contradiction in a lot of ways. It sounds counterintuitive. But surrender only truly works when you're doing it from the higher perspective, or from the true perspective, not the ego perspective. Because the ego perspective, remember, the ego is not trying to hurt you. It's just trying to keep you alive, trying to keep you surviving, right? But the problem with that is that it's such a small-minded, for lack of a better word, perspective, that you're missing out on what your true power really is, And I'm not saying that it can't work when you surrender from ego, because you will be motivated, maybe out of fear, though, that fear-based motivation to work your way back, and that's fine. But as Carolyn May says, if you know who she is, she always talks about we're all like 10-story buildings, and you've got the first floor, which is the 3D, most basic perspective, and then the higher you go, the higher your perspective, right? The higher your connection is. So when we, surrender from the first floor perspective, and we fight out of it from the first floor perspective, not that it won't work, but, and then you'll say, I did it. The hero's journey. I did it. I was in the doldrums and I did it. I turned it around. Now, granted, that could be wonderful. That could be wonderful, and that could be part of your journey. But don't make it harder on yourself than it already could be. No one's saying it's easy. But once you realize that surrender with a capital S, not a small s, the small s surrender is the small self, the ego self. the 3D human self. The big S surrender means you're surrendering knowing that you're really not surrendering anything. Because here's the deal, I will say this. You feel like the ego feels like it's losing control, right? That it's losing its job if you surrender from that perspective, you know. And from the ego perspective, when you do surrender from ego, you will lose all control. You will. Even if you think you're in control, even when you're doing things, you are not really in control. Ironically, it's when you surrender from the higher perspective, from the true self's perspective, from the divine self perspective, that when you surrender from that angle, you will have more control than you could ever imagine. It may not look like that, right? But you will have more control and more power without that ego's perspective than you ever could dream of. So again, surrendering when it's coming from the right place is the best practice. Because how many times in your life have you said, it is what it is, and then things just happen to work out magically, like a miracle, right? No coincidence there. So again, surrendering, make sure when you are ready to truly surrender. See, a lot of people don't know how to do this. We all work on it. We all struggle with it, of course, because we have that, ego-based survival mechanism. But I'll say it again. True surrender from the higher perspective, from the higher floors, as Carolyn Mace would say. Shout out to her. And I'll do more of a video on that in the future. But yeah, that's the way to go, because that's when things will unfold in ways you can't even imagine. All right. So with that, take care. Thank you.